There is no man in modern intelligence history who was harder to find than Ali Khamenei. Not because he was powerful, because he was patient. For 37 years, he governed one of the most volatile countries on Earth, and almost no one ever knew where he actually was. This is the story of the people who spent 25 years trying to change that. The analyst didn't have a name that appeared in any public record. That was intentional, not an oversight, not an administrative gap. A deliberate structural choice made by the people who created his role and understood what that role would eventually require. He was assigned to a single problem, not the Iranian nuclear file that had an entire directorate, dozens of analysts, years of satellite imagery, and a revolving door of political attention every time enrichment numbers moved. Not the IRGC that had its own targeting teams, its own human intelligence networks, its own threat assessments updated on a rolling basis. Not Hezbollah, not Hamas, not the web of proxy relationships Tehran had been weaving across the region since the 1980s. His assignment was narrower than any of those, and by most accounts, far less glamorous. He was assigned to map one man. Not to kill him, that was someone else's job, and it was a job that required a foundation that did not yet exist. The analyst's job came before the killing. It came before the targeting. It came before any of the operational planning that would eventually produce a 60-second strike window on a Saturday morning in central Tehran. His job was to understand a man who had spent his entire adult life ensuring that understanding him was impossible. To find the pattern inside the discipline of a man who had built his entire existence around not being found. The assignment came in 2001. He would still be working it a quarter century later. There is a question worth sitting with before this story goes further. Not a rhetorical one. An actual, operational question that the analyst had to answer before he could begin any of the work that followed. If the most protected leader in the Middle East had a network of underground bunkers buried 100 meters beneath Tehran, bunkers whose locations were known only to his innermost circle, bunkers designed by Iranian military engineers to withstand direct munitions strikes, what would you actually look for? If the officials who needed to meet him were blindfolded before being brought to his location, including senior figures like Ali Larijani, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, a man who had spent decades at the highest levels of the Iranian state. What does that tell you about the information environment you are operating in? If his sons acted as intermediaries, relaying decisions and receiving reports in his place, so that the supreme leader himself never needed to communicate directly with the apparatus of government. If his public appearances were staged, appearances designed to show presence, not reveal location. If the man had been surviving targeted operations since the early 1980s, when he himself survived an assassination attempt that cost him the use of his right arm, and had spent the 4 decades since then studying every method his enemies used to find people like him, you would not look for Khamenei. You would not look for his voice on an intercepted call, because he did not make calls. You would not look for his face in a satellite image, because he did not appear in the open. You would not look for his signature on a document, because documents with his name on them were handled by people you could not get close to. You would look for everyone around him, and then you would look for everyone around them. The analyst's methodology was not dramatic, it was structural. He understood early, within the first year of the assignment, according to people familiar with his approach, that Khamenei himself would never appear in a surveillance feed in any form that was operationally useful. He would never use a phone carelessly. He would never leave a digital footprint that pointed directly back to him. He would never appear on a street corner, in a restaurant, at an airport, or in any of the ordinary locations where ordinary surveillance catches ordinary people. The man had been surviving targeted operations since before most of the analyst's team had been born. He knew what surveillance looked like because he had built Iran's own surveillance state. He understood interception because Iran intercepted. He understood the logic of pattern analysis because Iran used pattern analysis against its own dissidents. He had, in effect, spent 40 years being educated in exactly the methods his enemies would use against him, and had built his personal security architecture as a direct counter to each of them. So the analyst started somewhere else entirely. He started with traffic cameras, Not satellites, not signals, not human assets embedded in Khamenei's household. Cameras, the ordinary, mundane, municipal road surveillance infrastructure of a city of 15 million people. The cameras that recorded license plates at intersections. The cameras that monitored traffic flow on the expressways linking Tehran's northern residential districts to its southern administrative centers. The cameras positioned at the entry and exit points of the old government quarter around Pasteur Street, where the offices of the Supreme Leader, the Iranian presidency, and the National Security Council had been located for decades. Unit 8200, Israel's Signals Intelligence Division, the same unit responsible for some of the most sophisticated cyber operations in modern intelligence history, including the Stuxnet worm that destroyed Iranian centrifuges at Natanz over a decade earlier, had been quietly and systematically embedded inside Tehran's road camera network. Not for a single operation, not in preparation for a specific strike that was already planned. The infiltration was initiated, maintained, sustained, and methodically expanded over a period of years. The camera feeds were routed to analytical centers outside Iran, through proxy servers, through encrypted tunnels, through infrastructure that left no Iranian-readable trace, and processed through AI-driven pattern recognition systems capable of analyzing years of footage in hours. The resulting data was cross-referenced against vehicle registrations, fuel procurement logs, and movement schedules belonging to members of Khamenei's protection detail. The men who drove his vehicles, the men who pre-cleared his routes, the men who arrived at locations 30 minutes before he did and left 30 minutes after, the men who stood outside buildings he was inside, wearing the same jackets, driving the same model cars, following the same rotation schedules week after week, year after year. One camera, in particular, became especially significant, not because of what it showed directly, but because of its angle. It captured the parking area where Khamenei's bodyguards and drivers habitually left their vehicles when he was in residence at or near the Pasteur Street compound. The angle was not dramatic. It was not a feed of a secured entrance or a protected facility. It was a camera pointed at a parking area, recording the same license plates arriving and departing at the same approximate times across hundreds of days. That camera became a calendar. Every time those vehicles appeared in that parking area on a Saturday morning, the analyst's team recorded it. Every time the rotation shifted, new drivers, additional vehicles, security detail members who only appeared when the principal was present, the model was updated. Every time a vehicle that had previously appeared only on weekdays appeared on a weekend, the anomaly was flagged, analyzed, and filed. None of this pointed directly to Khamenei. That was the point. The methodology was not designed to find him in the data. It was designed to build a model so detailed, so historically grounded, and so internally consistent that his presence could be inferred with high confidence from the behavior of the people around him, without ever requiring him to appear in the picture at all. The analyst called the logic simple, because it was. If you cannot find the planet, map the gravity field. Find every body that orbits the center, every vehicle, every rotation schedule, every protection detail member whose phone pinged a tower near Pasteur Street on a Saturday morning, and the center reveals itself. Not immediately, not in a single surveillance cycle. Over years of accumulation, pattern, and comparison, a shape emerges in the data that has only one explanation. The shape was a man, invisible in the feeds, present in everything around him. The analyst had spent a year building the methodology. He would spend the next 24 years filling it in. What the cameras could not yet tell him, and what the model would eventually expose as its own most dangerous blind spot, was a question that the analyst could not fully answer until it was almost too late. Tehran is a city of 15 million people. It has multiple government compounds, multiple hardened facilities, multiple locations capable of hosting a man who needed, above all else, to be somewhere his enemies did not expect. The camera network covered the city's road infrastructure. It did not cover the tunnels beneath it. And Khamenei had tunnels. How many, exactly, was a question the analyst's model had been trying to answer since 2001. By 2026, it still did not have a definitive answer. That gap, between what the cameras showed above ground and what existed beneath it, was the single most consequential piece of unresolved intelligence in the entire operation. It was also the piece that nobody in the planning room could afford to say out loud too clearly, because saying it out loud meant confronting a possibility that the entire operational architecture had been built to avoid confronting. That, after 25 years of work, after billions of data points, after one of the most sustained surveillance operations in modern intelligence history, the map might still be incomplete in exactly the place where it mattered most. What the cameras showed, slowly and over years, was a behavioral architecture. Certain vehicles clustered near certain buildings on certain mornings. Certain security rotation patterns accelerated on specific days of the week. Certain mobile phone towers near the old Pasteur Street compound in central Tehran showed anomalous traffic loads at irregular intervals. None of it pointed directly to Khamenei. All of it pointed toward him. The analyst filed assessment after assessment. The picture was building. The confidence level was rising. And here is the thing about confidence levels in intelligence work: they are not certainties. They are probabilities dressed in official language. Every assessment carried, somewhere in its appendix, a version of the same quiet warning. There was a second facility, equally fortified, equally deep, and the camera network had never been able to confirm its location with precision. If Khamenei chose the second bunker on the wrong morning, the entire map became useless. That fact sat at the bottom of every report the analyst wrote. It never went away. In October 2023, everything changed. Hamas launched the largest single-day massacre of Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. Within 72 hours, Israeli intelligence had confirmed what it had long assessed but never fully documented. The operation had been green-lit by Tehran. The financial transfers, the training rotations, the weapons pipelines, all of it ran through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the IRGC ran through one man. The Israeli cabinet convened. The Khamenei file, which had spent 22 years in the category of long-range strategic planning, was elevated. It was no longer a map project. It was a targeting project. The analysts' 22 years of camera feeds, behavioral analysis, and gravitational mapping suddenly had a different function. They were no longer the product of an academic intelligence exercise. They were pre-strike surveillance. But here is what the analyst knew that the cabinet room did not fully absorb in those first days. Knowing where someone tends to be is not the same as knowing where they will be. Khamenei had spent decades studying exactly this gap, the space between pattern and presence. He varied his schedules. He used decoys. He communicated through intermediaries. He had survived 4 decades of assassination planning by never being exactly where his enemies calculated he would be. To close that gap, they needed something the cameras could not provide. They needed someone on the inside. And that person, whoever they were, was now living in Tehran, gathering information that could only exist in one place, inside one system, accessible to one category of person. The operation had a map. It had a directive. It had 22 years of groundwork. What it did not yet have was the one piece of intelligence that would make all of it actionable. And somewhere in Tehran, someone was carrying that piece. Who they were and what it would cost them was a question the analysts' reports never answered. The 12-day war in June 2025 was supposed to answer a question. It did, just not the one anyone expected. When Israel launched its preemptive air campaign against Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure that summer, the operational objective was degradation: destroy the missile platforms, blind the radar networks, set back the nuclear program by years. By military metrics, it largely succeeded. But inside the intelligence community, the war produced something no strike package had ever produced before. It produced noise. And inside that noise was Khamenei. Under the sustained pressure of an active air campaign, the Supreme Leader's communications architecture, the one he had spent decades perfecting, began to fracture at its edges. Not collapse. Fracture. Backup channels were activated. Encryption protocols were shifted mid-operation. IRGC commanders who normally used intermediaries began making direct contact with the Supreme Leader's compound. The system held, but the seams showed. The CIA was watching all of it. For months, American analysts had been monitoring Khamenei's patterns, where he lived, whom he met with, how he communicated, and where he retreated under threat. The 12-day war was, in intelligence terms, the most productive surveillance environment they had ever operated in. Not because it exposed Khamenei directly, because it exposed how the people around him behaved when they were afraid. The analyst filed an updated assessment. The confidence level was upgraded for the first time in years. But here's the thing about confidence levels. They travel up chains of command, get briefed into cabinets, and become the foundation for decisions that cost lives. And the analyst knew, because he had written the footnotes himself, that the confidence level was built on one central assumption. The assumption was that Khamenei operated primarily from a single, hardened complex in central Tehran. That assumption was about to be tested. In January 2026, Iranian and American negotiators met in Geneva, facilitated by Oman, to discuss the nuclear file. The talks ended without agreement. But in the days that followed, something changed inside Tehran that the cameras could see but the analysts could not yet fully interpret. The movement patterns shifted. Vehicles that normally clustered near the Pasteur Street compound, the old administrative center housing the offices of the Supreme Leader, the Iranian Presidency, and the National Security Council, began appearing near a second location, a facility in the Lavizan district in the northeastern part of the city. The analysts' team had cataloged Lavizan before. It appeared in the margins of earlier reports as a secondary site, possible but unconfirmed. Now it was showing up in the feeds with frequency. The pattern of life model had been built around Pasteur Street for years. Now, for the first time, the data was suggesting that the model had a gap in it. There was a second bunker, and it was being used. The analyst pulled his team. They ran the analysis backward, 6 months of camera data, signals intercepts, vehicle tracking. The conclusion was uncomfortable. For a significant portion of the surveillance period, when the model had placed Khamenei at or near Pasteur Street with moderate to high confidence, he may have been in Lavizan. The 25-year map had been drawn around one location. The subject had quietly been using two. This is the moment in the operation that nobody briefed upward immediately. Not because it was hidden, because it was not yet understood. The analyst's team spent 3 days trying to determine whether the Lavizan activity represented a genuine shift in Khamenei's operating pattern, a deliberate attempt to create false signals in anticipation of a strike, or simply a rotation that had always existed and had gone undetected in the earlier data. They could not definitively answer the question. What they could determine was this. The munitions Israel had planned to use against the Pasteur Street compound were calibrated for that facility's specific depth and construction. The Lavizan site had different specifications, different depth estimates, different structural models. If the strike was launched against Pasteur Street and Khamenei was in Lavizan, the operation would eliminate 40 senior Iranian leaders and leave the Supreme Leader alive underground with full knowledge that his entire command structure had just been destroyed in a single morning. The analyst wrote a one-page summary. He titled it simply, Location Confidence Review. It was the first formal document in 25 years of this operation that recommended a pause. The pause request went up the chain on a Thursday. It came back down on Friday, not rejected, but folded into a larger conversation that the analyst had not been part of and had not anticipated. The diplomatic channel was still open. Inside the U.S. National Security Apparatus, a small group of senior officials had been quietly arguing for weeks that a military strike, if executed before another round of negotiations, would permanently foreclose any diplomatic resolution of the nuclear question. Iran had not walked away from Geneva. It had walked away from that round of Geneva. The distinction, in diplomatic terms, mattered. These officials were not opposed to military action. They were opposed to the timing, and the analyst's location confidence review had, inadvertently, handed them an argument. If the intelligence isn't fully confirmed, they said, this is not the window. The operational team disagreed. The military planners disagreed. The Israeli side, which had been running its own parallel track since October 7, disagreed with particular force. From their perspective, every day that passed was a day the leadership could disperse further. The location model could degrade further, and the window could close permanently. Internally, the debate became what one person later described as a fracture. Not a policy disagreement, but a genuine split about what the intelligence was actually saying and whose job it was to interpret it. The analyst was asked to rebrief. He walked back into the room and said something that would later be described differently by different people who were present. He said, "The confidence in Pasteur Street is high. The confidence that Khamenei will not be in Lavizan on the morning of the operation is not the same level. Those are two different statements." They were heard in that room as one. By February 24, a new intelligence thread had entered the picture. A meeting. Not a routine gathering of mid-level officials. A high-level convening of Iran's political and military leadership, the Defense Council, the National Security Council, the IRGC Senior Command, scheduled for Saturday morning, February 28, at the Pasteur Street compound. And Khamenei would be there. The source of that intelligence was not a camera feed. It was not a signals intercept. It was human. Someone inside the regime had confirmed the meeting, its participants, and the location. The analyst read the intelligence report and understood two things simultaneously. The first was that the window he had been building toward for 25 years had just opened. The second was that whoever had provided this intelligence was now the single most exposed person in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the moment the operation launched, every surviving Iranian intelligence officer would begin looking for them. The operation had a window. But using the window meant closing it forever for someone else. The question was not whether the intelligence was reliable. The question was whether the people in that room had fully calculated what confirming it would cost and to whom. Nobody in the room said that out loud. The planning moved forward. The original plan called for a midnight strike. That decision had been made months earlier, when the operation was still theoretical, a contingency architecture rather than an active order. Night provided cover for the aircraft, degraded Iran's visual tracking of incoming munitions, and reduced the probability of civilian presence near the compound. Every doctrine Israel had developed through decades of precision targeting said the same thing. If you are going to strike in the center of a capital city, you do it in darkness. The Human Intelligence Report changed that calculus in a single sentence. The meeting was Saturday morning, not Saturday night, not the early hours of Sunday. Saturday morning, in daylight, in the middle of Tehran's administrative center, with Khamenei and 40 of Iran's most senior military and political figures seated in one building. The operational team had approximately 72 hours to decide whether to abandon the strike doctrine they had spent months refining or abandon the window. They chose the window. But the choice was not clean, and the preparation for a daylight strike against a hardened urban compound was not the same preparation they had been running. Targeting packages were revised. Approach vectors were recalculated. The question of how Iran's air defense network would respond to a daytime incursion, with operators awake, radar systems at full operational tempo, military communications active, had to be assessed against infrastructure that had been significantly degraded during the June campaign but had not been destroyed entirely. The first problem emerged before a single aircraft moved. On the morning of February 27, the day before the scheduled operation, one of the camera feeds on Pasteur Street went dark. Not hacked, not jammed. It simply stopped transmitting. The feed had been running continuously for years. Analysts could not immediately determine whether the outage was technical failure, routine maintenance, or the possibility that made the room go quiet, a deliberate shutdown by Iranian security personnel who had detected the infiltration. The analyst was pulled into an emergency assessment session. If the Iranians had found the camera access, the entire surveillance architecture was potentially compromised. Not just that feed, the entire network. Every pattern of life model built on camera data from the last several years had to be treated as potentially visible to Iranian counterintelligence. If they knew what had been watched, they knew what had been mapped. If they knew what had been mapped, they might know what was coming. An abort recommendation circulated for the second time. It lasted 4 hours. The assessment that came back, built on technical analysis of the outage signature, concluded that the feed failure was consistent with a power interruption to the camera's local grid node. Not a targeted shutdown, a mundane infrastructure failure in a city that experienced routine power cuts across its older administrative districts. The conclusion was assessed as probable, not certain. The operation was not aborted. But the 4-hour window of genuine uncertainty had introduced something into the room that technical assessments cannot fully dispel: the possibility that everything proceeding from this point was proceeding on a compromised foundation. The analyst did not record his personal assessment of the camera outage in any official document. What he said in that room to the people in that room has not been reported publicly. The planning moved forward. By Friday evening, Israeli F-35 Ayadir stealth fighters operating from beyond Iranian airspace had been repositioned and were airborne. The aircraft were carrying Sparrow missiles, long-range precision munitions capable of striking a target the size of a conference table from over 1,000 kilometers away. They would not enter Iranian airspace at all. They did not need to. Simultaneously, the NSA and Unit 8200 began executing coordinated cyber attacks against Iran's air defense network, degrading radar coverage across the western approaches to Tehran, fragmenting command and control communications, and suppressing the IRGC's ability to vector interceptors toward an incoming strike. The operation had a second track running in parallel that most people in the broader coordination structure did not know about. Israeli operatives on the ground, not near the compound, but distributed across the communications infrastructure of central Tehran, began introducing targeted disruptions to individual components of approximately a dozen mobile phone towers near Pasteur Street. The disruption was engineered to look like network congestion, not a blackout, not a jamming signature, just busy signals, phones that rang out, calls that connected and dropped. Khamenei's protection detail relied on a specific set of communication channels for threat warnings. Those channels were now effectively silent, without any indicator to the people holding the phones that the silence was deliberate. And here is where the incorrect assumption began to play out. The operational planners had assumed that the protection detail's primary warning pathway was external. Incoming calls from monitoring units positioned around the city. Disrupt the towers, disrupt the warnings. What they had not fully accounted for was the internal communication loop within the compound itself. The protection detail used a separate, short-range encrypted radio system for intra-compound coordination, a system that did not route through any of the disrupted towers. That system was operational throughout the morning. For approximately 11 minutes before the strike, the detail was conducting what appeared to be a routine security check. Vehicles were logged, entry points were confirmed, the rotations were running on schedule. There was a moment, documented in post-operation reconstruction, when a member of the detail attempted to reach an external monitoring unit and received no response. He attempted twice more. He noted the failed contact in the compound's internal log at 9:47 a.m. local time. He attributed it to network congestion. He was correct about the congestion. He was incorrect about the cause. He marked the log entry as a routine anomaly and did not escalate. At 9:52 a.m. local time, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson appeared on state television. He was composed, he was deliberate. He spoke in the measured cadence of a government that had prepared for exactly this moment, a moment when the outside world would be watching and the regime's posture would either hold or crack in public. He stated that Iran's leadership was in full command of the country's defensive operations, that reports of casualties among senior officials were false, and that the Islamic Republic's armed forces were prepared to respond to any aggression against the sovereignty of the Iranian nation. He specifically said, Ayatollah Khamenei is safe and in full command. He looked directly into the camera when he said it. For a period of approximately 90 minutes, that statement was reported by international news organizations as an uncontested claim. Wire services carried it without qualification. Reuters and AFP distributed the quote globally within minutes. Foreign ministries in capitals across the region noted it and paused their own public statements to see what followed. Anchors on Arabic-language satellite networks repeated it on air. Several intelligence analysts in Washington and Tel Aviv, monitoring the open-source environment in real time, saw the statement and registered it as a data point, not a confirmed fact, a claim requiring verification. but a claim that had, for now, landed in the public record with the weight of an official government position. That weight was its own kind of problem. There was a moment, brief but real, in the operations command structure where that statement introduced a specific and acute crisis. Not a strategic crisis, not a diplomatic one, a targeting confirmation crisis. If the statement was true, if the strike had somehow failed to penetrate the correct location within the compound, if Khamenei had moved rooms, gone deeper, exited through a tunnel. Exit the surveillance architecture had not mapped. Then Iran's supreme leader was alive, underground, with full knowledge that 40 of his most senior commanders had just been killed in a single morning. The IRGC commander, the defense minister, his own family members, the entire defense council. The operation would have produced the single worst outcome the analyst's location confidence review had flagged 8 days earlier, in language everyone in the room had read and no one had fully answered. A decapitation strike that decapitated everyone except the head. And a supreme leader who survived that, who walked out of a bunker knowing that his entire command structure had been eliminated around him, would not be a weakened adversary. He would be an adversary with nothing left to lose, no institutional structure to moderate him, and every reason to authorize whatever retaliatory capability still existed. The analyst team sat with that possibility for 90 minutes, not passively. They were running signals, analysis, monitoring satellite imagery feeds, cross-referencing every available indicator of activity inside the compound and across Tehran's emergency communications infrastructure. They were looking for anything that would tell them, definitively, one way or the other. They did not find it in the data. They found it in the absence of something else entirely. The false release moment lasted 90 minutes. Then the Iranian state went silent. Not quieter, not more measured. Silent. State television cut its broadcast mid-segment. The foreign ministry spokesperson did not appear again. The official Twitter accounts of the Iranian presidency and the Supreme Leader's office, which had been active throughout the morning, posting defiant statements and religious verses, stopped producing output entirely. IRGC-affiliated media channels, which had been running a continuous stream of content since the first strikes began, went dark simultaneously. It was not the silence of a government managing a crisis. It was the silence of a government that no longer knew who was in charge. In intelligence assessment, the absence of a signal is itself a signal. A government that has just lost its supreme leader does not immediately know how to speak. It does not know which surviving official has the authority to issue statements. It does not know whether to confirm, deny, or simply go quiet while the internal scramble for control begins. A government whose leader survived would not stop speaking. A government that had just successfully deflected a major strike would be louder, not quieter. It would be projecting continuity, projecting strength, projecting the image of an unbroken chain of command. That is what authoritarian governments do in moments of military confrontation. They speak, loudly, continuously. The silence that followed the foreign ministry spokesperson's last appearance was not grief. It was institutional paralysis. The silence held. The 90-minute claim dissolved into it. And the question that the analyst's team had carried for 25 years, whether the map they had built, the camera feeds and pattern models and human networks and signals intercepts, whether all of it would ever be precise enough to matter, was answered inside a 60-second strike window, in broad daylight, in the center of a city of 15 million people. Not elegantly, not cleanly. With a false start that almost triggered a 48-hour delay, a 4-hour abort discussion triggered by a camera that went dark at the worst possible moment, a protection detail member who almost escalated a log entry that would have changed everything, and then 90 minutes where the entire outcome hung on the absence of a television broadcast rather than the presence of confirmed intelligence. The operation felt, until the silence confirmed it, exactly as fragile as it had always been, not in retrospect, in the room, in real time, among the people who had built the operation and were now waiting for a state television broadcast to tell them whether it had worked. The silence that followed the Iranian state's last broadcast did not last in the wider region. Within 2 hours, Iran launched retaliatory strikes against Israel and U.S. military installations across the region. Missile salvos and drone swarms were directed at targets inside Israel and at American forward operating bases in Gulf states. The strikes were not symbolic gestures. They were coordinated launches, drawing on whatever remained of Iran's strike architecture after 8 months of systematic degradation. People died in them. But the strikes were blunted in ways that made their full scope visible in real time. Patriot and THAAD battery networks absorbed much of the incoming fire over Israel. U.S. naval assets in the Gulf intercepted drone packages before they reached their target coordinates. What Iran launched on February 28 was the remnant of a strategic deterrent that had been systematically hollowed out, first in June 2025, then again during Midnight Hammer, and again in the coordinated infrastructure strikes that preceded Operation Epic Fury by 72 hours. The attacks arrived. They caused damage. They did not change the military balance. What they confirmed, in operational terms, was something more specific and more significant than tactical failure. They confirmed that the regime's ability to project coordinated force had been severed from its ability to project will. A state can want to retaliate at maximum capacity, but wanting and executing are separated by a command structure. And the command structure that would have directed the second wave assessed the damage reports from the first, allocated remaining assets to priority targets, and made the decision about whether to escalate further. That structure had been in the Pasteur Street compound on Saturday morning. The missiles flew, but they flew without instruction. They flew as a reflex, not a strategy. That distinction between retaliation as a coordinated military act and retaliation as an institutional death spasm mattered more than the damage reports from any individual strike site. That was the tactical picture. The strategic picture was different, and darker, and far less resolved, because what the operation had produced, beneath the immediate military calculus, was a region that no longer had a single authoritative Iranian voice. Not to threaten, not to negotiate, not to restrain the proxy forces that Iran had spent 40 years building and directing across 7 countries. The missiles that fell on February 28 were a response. The silence that followed was a vacuum. And in intelligence terms, a vacuum in a region full of armed, non-state actors, fractured succession struggles, and 3 decades of accumulated grievance is not a solved problem. It is a different category of problem entirely. One with no map, no camera network, no pattern of life model. One that the analyst had not been assigned to solve, and one that no one, in the 72 hours of planning that preceded the operation, had produced a document to address. Iran declared 7 days of public holiday and 40 days of national mourning. The Iranian presidency issued a formal statement through President Mossad Pezeshkian's office, not through the Supreme Leader's office, because that office no longer had an occupant, condemning the killing as a great crime and vowing that the blood of Khamenei would, as the statement put it, flow like a roaring spring and eradicate American Zionist oppression. The language was the language of a government that had lost its center and was reaching for its most familiar register: defiance. Because defiance was the only institutional vocabulary it still possessed. But a statement is not a command structure. A vow is not a succession plan. Iran's constitutional framework does not have a clean pathway for replacing a supreme leader killed in an active military operation. The Assembly of Experts, the clerical body technically responsible for selecting a successor, was fractured along factional lines that had been building for years. Hardliners, pragmatists, Revolutionary Guard-aligned figures who had their own ideas about who should hold the role. Each faction had survived the strike. None of them had enough institutional weight to impose a consensus. The regime was still standing, but it was standing without a spine. Here is what the operation did not solve, and what the people who authorized it knew it would not solve. The proxy network remained. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, Iraqi Shia militias, Syrian remnant forces, all of them had operated for decades under Iranian strategic direction and Iranian financial support. They were not destroyed by the strike on Pasteur Street. They were orphaned by it. And an orphaned proxy network, stripped of central direction and cut off from its primary funding architecture, does not dissolve. It fragments, it localizes, It makes decisions that no one in Tehran can authorize or prevent. In intelligence terms, this is called decentralization risk. A centralized adversary has a decision-maker who can be deterred, negotiated with, or eliminated. A decentralized adversary has neither. What replaced Khamenei's strategic coordination was not peace. It was a region full of armed actors with ideological motivation, established supply lines, and no one left to tell them when to stop. The operation had removed the man most capable of ordering restraint, along with the man most capable of ordering escalation. That distinction matters. It had been discussed in planning. It had not been resolved. The nuclear file presented a version of the same problem. The Natanz enrichment facility had been struck during Operation Midnight Hammer and again during the follow-on strikes of Operation Epic Fury. The IAEA confirmed damage to entrance structures of the underground centrifuge halls. The physical infrastructure of the program had been degraded severely. But nuclear programs are not buildings. They are knowledge. They are personnel. They are the institutional memory of a scientific establishment that had been building toward weapons capability for 30 years. Some of those scientists were at the Pasteur Street compound on the morning of February 28. Most were not. The people who designed the program, who trained the next generation of engineers, who held the methodological knowledge in their heads, they were not at a political meeting on a Saturday morning. They were at universities, at secondary facilities, at homes in Isfahan and Yazd and Mashhad. The strike had destroyed the program's current leadership and its primary physical infrastructure. It had not destroyed the program's continuity. The question that would define the next decade was whether a successor Iranian government, whatever form it took, would inherit the knowledge, the motivation, and a new reason to accelerate toward the one capability that had now been demonstrated, beyond any remaining doubt, to be the only thing that made a country truly untouchable. Nobody in the room on February 27 had an answer to that question. Nobody in any room does now. Return, for a moment, to the human intelligence source. The one who confirmed the meeting. The one who provided the single piece of intelligence that converted 25 years of camera feeds and pattern analysis into an actionable window. The precision of the operation was itself a signal. The 60-second strike window. The daylight timing override. The simultaneous hits on 3 buildings within the compound. This was not a lucky strike. This was a surveillance architecture that had reached into the innermost layer of the regime's operational planning. Every surviving Iranian intelligence officer understood this. The hunt for that source began, by most accounts, within hours of Khamenei's death being confirmed. Not as a formal investigation, the formal investigation infrastructure had also largely been destroyed in the morning strikes. As something less organized and more dangerous, a distributed search, conducted by surviving IRGC elements, hardline factional networks, and whatever remained of the Ministry of Intelligence's operational capacity. The analyst's operation had built a human source into its architecture and had not, in any document that has been made public, produced a parallel extraction plan of equivalent sophistication. The cameras were years in the making. The exit strategy for the person who made the cameras matter. That timeline has not been reported. That silence is its own kind of answer. The analyst, for his part, had spent 25 years building a map of a man who did not want to be found. The map worked. The window opened. The operation executed in 60 seconds after a quarter-century of preparation. And what he was left with, what anyone involved in an operation of this scale is left with, was not triumph. It was the next question. Not whether the strike succeeded, that was settled. Whether the thing the strike was supposed to prevent had been made more or less likely by the fact that it succeeded. That question does not have a clean answer. It may not have one for a generation. The operations you hear about are the ones that worked. The costs you never hear about are the ones that were paid quietly by people whose names don't appear in any public record in the months that follow. That's what we cover here. If you want to understand how intelligence operations are actually built, not the headline, not the outcome, but the architecture, the decisions, the things that almost went wrong and the things that quietly broke, subscribe to Hidden Ops.